Fire Emblem has always been a series that focuses on story and characters above anything else, but the fact still remains that Fire Emblem is a video game, and as such the chapters or levels in Fire Emblem are where the action takes place, because it's certainly more exciting than have the characters talk their way out of every situation. In the case of Fire Emblem Fates Conquest, level design is one of the game's strongest aspects, since the majority of chapters are challenging, interesting, unique, original, offer different objectives and are an overall great time. Though sadly that can't be said for every chapter in the game.
Chapter 10, Chapter 10, Chapter 10!
Yeah, we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. Throughout most of Conquest, I had a great time tackling the game's chapters and conquering the many challenges I was presented with, which Conquest was filled to the brim with, believe me. So today, I felt it was time I addressed which of the chapters in Conquest were my 10th favourite, either for their design, originality, impact on the story, or just how much fun they were. Just a few things to clear up before we get started. 1. This is just my opinion, and I'm simply ranking these chapters on how much I enjoyed them, so don't be surprised if a chapter you either love or hate is or isn't on this list. 2. I'm not including the first 6 chapters of the game since they're part of every pathway rather than being Conquest exclusive. 3. In terms of difficulty, because I know someone is going to ask that question, I played and will play every pathway of Fates on hard mode. And finally, no, I'm not going to include the paralog chapters since they're going to get their own list at some point. And of course there's going to be spoilers for Conquest. Oh, and if you're wondering, top 10 worst Conquest chapters will be my next video, because even I had chapters I hated in Conquest.
Chapter 10, Chapter 10, Chapter 10!
Okay, I get it, sheesh, calm down already. And with all that cleared up, it's time to march forward and tackle the best chapters that Conquest has to offer. They may not have been easy, but that doesn't stop them from being awesome. Sometimes, in order to get the best result, you need to divide up your army and send the right units to fight the right enemies in order to achieve victory. Divide and conquer, as they say. Well, in the case of Conquest, nowhere is this phrase better used than in Chapter 11, Rainbow Sage. Nothing like tackling a level where you're essentially controlling many different one-man armies. Yes, starting off this countdown we have Chapter 11, otherwise known as Rainbow Sage. Now on its own, this chapter is a pretty decent level that offers a good challenge and rewards you with things like treasure. But this level, more than most, really emphasizes the use of the correct classes to fight specific enemies, as well as separating your army to fight the oncoming threat as quickly as possible. Like I said, divide and conquer, or in this case, divide and conquest. In Chapter 11, Corrin is making his or her way up the mountain in the search for the Rainbow Sage, only to discover that the Hoshido army is there along with Hanoka, which should be a bad sign, but if you can get past the previous chapter and survive the butthurt Takumi, you should be just fine. Chapter 11's main gimmick is that it is split up into multiple rooms with multiple enemies of specific classes occupying each room. By utilizing the new stairs mechanic, which I really like by the way, you can send your units through each room to deal with the enemy. Because of how the map is set up and structured, it really encourages and practically forces you to use the correct units on your team to deal with the right enemies, since you'll be facing many of the same classes in a single room. As such, you have to know what units are best for each situation, since most of the time they're not going to have the aid of the rest of the army behind them, so make sure you know what classes are best suited to counter other classes. For instance, Effie the Knight is great for dealing with archers, but don't let Camilla get too close to them. What I really like about this chapter is how it tests your knowledge of each Fire Emblem class and how to best deal with the enemy and their classes, as well as encouraging you to raise up a varied team of units and classes in order to have enough strong candidates to deal with the amount of enemies you're going to be facing. I also like the way this chapter implements a new stairs mechanic, as it makes it much easier and quicker to divide up your team in order to conquer each room, as well as regrouping in order to assist other units and retreat where necessary. While not outstanding, I really liked Chapter 11 and found it to be loads of fun to have certain units just tanking the onslaught of enemies in each of the rooms. While the chapter can get rather one-sided depending on the classes you use and their levels, I still find it to offer a good challenge, but not to the point in which you want to tear your hair out, which is a much needed change of pace compared to the last chapter. Sometimes taking the best aspects of different things and combining them into one can lead to some very strong results. For example, what would happen if you took the mechanics and overall level design of Chapter 11 and combined it with the sense of dread and emotional weight of Chapter 10? Well, in this case, we'd get Chapter 23. It's amazing what can happen when you take the best aspects of something and combine it with the best aspects of another. Is that what Revelations is going to be like? Because I certainly hope so. Anyway, coming in at number 9 we have Chapter 23, Possessed, a chapter that can be best described as if Chapter 10 decided for once not to be an evil bitch and made sweet love to Chapter 11, and then this baby popped out because Chapter 23 feels like a mix of both Chapter 10 and 11, as the level design and mechanics are similar to that of Chapter 11, but the emotional weight of the chapter is similar to that of Chapter 10. In Chapter 23, Korin and the Nohrian army are in the process of conquering Hoshido, only now they must get past Takumi, who at this point is so butthurt you can practically feel the blood gushing out of his anus. Ew. Anyway, Chapter 23 has you making your way up the Great Wall and defeating Takumi in order for the rest of the Nohrian army to invade. At first you must deal with the enemies on the ground, and then make your way up the stairs and defeat those defending the wall and then Takumi himself, as well as the many ballistas stationed on this map, which hurt but thankfully cannot kill a unit. This chapter I find to be a chapter that tends to flip-flop in how you approach and deal with the enemies depending on which part of the map you're on, since there will be many times where you have to hold the defensive line and others where you have to really push forward and deal with the enemy in a single turn before they can retaliate. This change in level progression helps to keep you on your toes, and the chapter encourages you to make sure you have enough offensive, defensive and support units to deal with each part of the map and the type of enemies you'll be facing. As such, there are many ways in which you can tackle this chapter, but you simply can't stick to one tried and true method, otherwise you'll more than likely get killed. What really makes this chapter though is the drama that unfolds, since at this point Takumi is so torn up inside and tortured that he's gone past the point of no return and wants nothing more than to see you die. And it really shows that how depending on the pathway you choose, the characters change based on your choices, and you have to live with it. In the end, Chapter 23 was a fun and challenging chapter that kept changing things up for the better and encouraged you to adopt different playstyles as the events unfold. While not the best chapter in the game, it still stands out as being a strong chapter and being one of the more emotional chapters in Conquest, at which point I think they should change the title from Fire Emblem Fates to Fire Emblem Feels. So the time is now. The entire game has been building up to this moment, and even though you don't want to go through with it, it's time to invade Hoshido. And to start with, we have to defeat the youngest of the Hoshido royal family, Princess Sakura. Man, Fates, was this necessary? I mean, I understand easing the player into the experience, so naturally you don't want to face the strongest enemies first. Wouldn't that be something? Fighting Ryoma the moment you set foot in Hoshido? This guy doesn't fuck around. But did we really have to fight Princess Sakura first? I mean, come on, a fight like this is kind of one-sided, don't you think? Well, in actuality, it may not be as one-sided as you think, since no chapter in Conquest is one-sided or easy, and Chapter 22 is no exception to this, since this chapter is challenging and is the textbook definition of turtling in because of the map's design and structure. In Chapter 22, the invasion of Hoshido has begun, and to start with, we have to defeat Princess Sakura, because nothing says Nohrian scum like going for the youngest and most vulnerable member of the royal family. Man, Garen, you're really not helping your country's image there. Anyway, in Chapter 22, you must seize the fort, but this chapter has your army divided in two and unable to regroup until you reach the boss. This chapter is a very boxed in and restricted chapter, as you don't have much space or breathing room to move your units about, and very often you find yourself turtling in order to tank the enemy that attacks you in narrow spaces. As such, much like Chapter 11, this chapter is very class dependent, since you need to make sure that your units are able to deal with the onslaught of enemies that will bombard you, as well as the many, and I mean many, respawning units you have to deal with. While this may seem daunting, it's not as bad as you think, since the enemies are spread out evenly enough so that you deal with handfuls of them at a time rather than all at once. Not to mention, if you like, you can pair up all your units on one side of the map and just rush straight to the boss and overpower the enemy on either the left or right side of the map. Also, the dragon veins in this chapter allow you to lower certain walls on your turn, allowing your units much more freedom to move about and reach areas earlier than normal. But be careful because Sakura will close those walls on her turn and summon many more reinforcements. In the end, Chapter 22 was the beginning of everything Conquest had been building up to, but Hoshido wasn't going down without a fight, and Chapter 22 certainly put up a fight. being a very tight and cramped chapter that makes you turtle in and tank the enemy like a motherfucker, but also offered you the chance of more freedom with the risk of dealing with more enemies. Oh, and if you're wondering, no, I did not fight Sakura during this chapter. I mean, why would I? She's so damn timid. What do you take me for, some kind of monster? The Nohrian royal family was one of the best aspects of Conquest, and probably Fates in general, as I love all these characters so much and each of them were a great help on the battlefield. Throughout the course of the game you get each of the family members back on certain chapters, but it wasn't until chapter 16 when the entire family was together again. And oh man did it feel great! Nothing like a bit of violence and bloodshed to bring the family together, eh? Because that was exactly the case with number 7 on this list, chapter 16, Invasion. But wait, didn't the invasion officially begin in chapter 22, or is this just the prelude to the invasion? Either way, this chapter was a great chapter and finally allowed you to have all your brothers and sisters by your side kicking ass together. In chapter 16, the invasion of Hoshido has begun and Korin and the gang have set sail for Hoshido, but along the way the ship is ambushed by pirates, as there is a traitor amongst the group who sold you out, because goddammit, it's not a Fire Emblem game if there aren't some form of pirates in it. The purpose of this chapter is to find out who the traitor is and defeat him, and each turn you don't, you'll lose 300 of the 10,000 gold that you will receive at the end of the chapter. With the objective in mind, the way you tackle this chapter is entirely up to you. Do you rush down the enemy and go straight for the traitor depending on where he is in order to get as much money as possible, or do you take things slowly and tackle the enemy one by one in order to make sure everyone is safe while at the same time not receiving much money as a result? This chapter allows for a lot of freedom to let the player proceed with how they want to tackle the chapter, as well as being a high risk and high reward chapter, as if you decide to play it safe the chapter is easier but you receive less money. However, if you decide to be a daredevil you can end this chapter early, but at the risk of the chapter being harder along the way. Either way, this chapter is still challenging, and since you get Xander in this chapter, he can be used as one of your best offensive or defensive units depending on how you like to play. This chapter also gives you the opportunity of killing or sparing the boss Shura, or however it's pronounced, either adding him to your team or getting boots for killing him, which may sound like a no-brainer choice, but I don't know, boots are a really good reward item, you heartless bastard. Hey, that's the price to pay for siding with Nohr. I said it once and I'll say it again, the Nohr royal family are some of my favourite characters in Fates, and chapter 16 finally gives you the chance to use them all, which by itself is reason enough to put this chapter on this list, but the addition of a unique chapter with a lot of freedom behind it makes it one of the best chapters in Conquest. Fire Emblem games always have those pivotal moments or chapters throughout the series which have major impacts on the story and the game as a whole. For example, we have chapter 19 from Blazing Sword, chapter 15 from Sacred Stones, chapter 7 from Path of Radiance, chapter 9 from Awakening, and in the case of Conquest, chapter 14, The Voice of Paradise. This was the point in Fates or Conquest where the main goal of the story kicked in and the game elevated to a higher plane. Not only because this chapter is a really good chapter with some really awesome level design and great new units, but also because of the story events that unfold, featuring one of the best songs in the entire Fates soundtrack. Chapter 14 takes place in the Opera House, where a mysterious dancer who clearly isn't Azura is on stage singing a song of conquest and faith, while at the same time demonstrating her amazing waterbending powers, much to the irritation of King Garen. I guess Azura brought up bad memories of the last Airbender movie, which would actually explain a lot about King Garen's attitude. Anyway, the performance is interrupted as Hoshido attacks and Korin and the gang have to stop them, along with Leo and the brand new character Keaton, the Tsundere Wolfman. And I never thought I would go through my life and use the term Tsundere Wolfman in a sentence. Chapter 14 from the visual aspect alone is a great chapter, since it takes place during the Opera House and the atmosphere surrounding the battlefield is just incredible. Not only that, but the level design is structured around how the Opera House is laid out, as you have to move across the boats and how they are positioned in the map, which makes the chapter very unique, and I like that attention to detail. Along with that, the map is still challenging, but a lot more manageable compared to most Conquest chapters thanks to the units you get in this chapter, and despite being rather linear in terms of progression, the map is rather large, and your units have a good amount of space to move about and tackle the enemy from all sides. It is also in this chapter where you start to understand more about the situation in the Nohrian army and the story as a whole, as well as one of Leo's best moments where he explains that the way he acts on the surface allows him to avoid Garen's suspicion and proceed to deal with the situation the way he sees fit. Fire Emblem games have always had moments where shit gets real and the story shifts into high gear, and well, Chapter 14 of Conquest was just that, as it became one of the most standout moments in Fate and Fire Emblem as a whole, and provided us with a very fun and unique chapter, as well as 2 great units to add to the team, as well as giving us possible insight as to why Garen's soul became so corrupted, because the last Airbender movie will do that to you.
Embrace the dark, you call a home.
Whether you choose Conquest or Birthright, it was inevitable that at some point you will invade either Nohr or Hoshido and face either royal family. Apparently Takumi simply couldn't wait that long, since not only does he try to kill you in Chapter 10, but he tries to kill you once again in Chapter 13. Man, Takumi really didn't take you siding with Nohr well, since this guy's thirst for revenge would make even Ike slightly worried, and he lost his father right in front of his own eyes. Well, since attacking you once wasn't enough for him, he decides to do it again in Chapter 13, Uprising. Now this chapter is a lot more traditional in terms of Fire Emblem chapters compared to some of the other entries on this list, but that doesn't stop it from being loads of fun and a chapter where, like Chapter 14, you get 2 really good units on your side. In Chapter 13, Corrin has been sent to deal with the uprising in Sheva, or however it's pronounced, and he hopes to settle the conflict peacefully. But before they can start the negotiations, Takumi appears and tries to kill you once again. At this point, Takumi won't listen to reason, so instead you have to take it upon yourself to beat the message into him, much like Zelgis beat the message into Skimir. The chapter itself is very much a route mission, only that the map is laid out so that you can tackle the enemy by splitting your team up and fighting them head on, or flanking them by dealing with the enemy on either the left or right side first. While not too spectacular, this chapter is loads of fun since you're up against a good chunk of varied enemies that, while not too strong, can be rather tough if you're not careful, and there's a good chunk of houses for you to collect items and rewards. Not only that, but you also get 2 of the best non-royal units in the game, Benny the Knight and Charlotte the Fighter, with Benny being a knight with ridiculous amount of defense and Charlotte being one of the best fighters in any Fire Emblem game and one of my favourite Conquest characters. It is also here where Corrin's influence and morals are tested, since in the end the villagers are killed against Corrin's wishes, and he asks Camilla why this has to happen. She tells him she doesn't have the answers, or knows why King Garen does these types of things, only that he won't hesitate to kill any of his children if they disobey him. As such, she buries her feelings even amongst the atrocities taking place, because she understands that sometimes the situation can't be helped and you can't save everyone. This is pretty much what fuels Corrin's need to change Nohr from the inside, but also helps to show that, like Leo, Camilla has her own sense of morals but also understands when some situations are hopeless, and is actually a rather interesting and complex character instead of just being used as fan service like a lot of people wrongly accuse her of being. Sometimes being good doesn't mean you have to be completely unique and original, but rather knowing exactly what to do and doing it well. Chapter 13 is a prime example of this, since despite being rather by the numbers, the chapter is still loads of fun, challenging, engaging, gives you 2 great characters and has a rather big impact on the story. It also shows us that Takumi is the saltiest person ever. Don't let that guy play Dark Souls.
Embrace the dark, you call a home.
As much as I tried to avoid any and all information surrounding Fates until it released in Europe, there were times where I simply happened to stumble upon various comments about the game, in particular about which chapters sucked most. Everyone was going on about how Chapter 10, 17, 20 and 25 were some of the worst chapters in the game. Well, I can agree that some of those chapters suck.
Chapter 10, Chapter 10, Chapter 10.
Alright, enough already, we get the picture. I have to disagree with people's thoughts on Chapter 20, because I don't know what you guys are talking about. I fucking love that chapter. Oh man, I bet people are foaming at the mouth right now, since many people hate Chapter 20 with a burning passion. Well, to each their own, but I honestly don't see what the problem with Chapter 20 is, since I had a great time and found it to be one of the most original chapters in any Fire Emblem game. And before you ask, no, I'm not a masochist for liking Chapter 20. If I was, chapters like Day in a Rise, Battle Before Dawn, Day Breaks, and Unhappy Reunion would be some of my favourite Fire Emblem chapters, which they certainly aren't. In Chapter 20, The Winds of Change, Corrin and the gang are trying to pass through the Wind Tribe's territories, but sadly the negotiations aren't going well, go figure. However, after meeting the Chief Fuga and explaining the situation to him, he offers you a test to see if you're worthy of wielding the Yato Blade, and that test takes the form of Chapter 20. Now the chapter's main gimmick and what makes the chapter so unique is the wind mechanic, where a stream of wind will either push your units up or down 5 spaces on the map, or wherever is closest to land at the end of the enemy's turn. Now most people hate this gimmick since it can prematurely lead you to fighting units you weren't prepared for and getting killed, but honestly I think that it's a really cool concept that adds to the level rather than takes away from it. I find that the wind mechanic adds a sense of strategy and challenge to the chapter, as carelessness can easily lead you straight to your death, but if you plan ahead and use the wind to your advantage, you can move ahead many spaces as well as take major shortcuts in the chapter and get the upper hand on the enemy. With this in mind, I find Chapter 20 to be a lot of fun as it focuses on planning ahead as well as adapting to the changing weather currents, and being able to use them to benefit your team makes you feel like a real tactician, while at the same time ignoring them will get you killed. Even without the wind currents, the chapter is fun to tackle, and the layout leans toward more linear progression, almost like a maze of some sort, which is pretty cool. While one of the more hated chapters in Conquest, I personally found a lot of good in it, and found it to be probably one of the most underrated Fire Emblem chapters. Now there's a list I can do at some point. I feel that if you don't know how to adapt to the changing winds or plan ahead, you're going to hate this chapter, but if you use them to your advantage, then if anything you should at the very least enjoy this chapter. Not love it, but have fun regardless. Or just get salty at the fact that I happen to like something that most people hate. Well, it wouldn't be the first time.
Embrace the dark you call home.
Ice or snow levels are a very hit and miss trope when it comes to video games. Some people love them and some people hate them. Personally, I'm of the mindset where it depends on the game, since ice levels in Sonic, Crash Bandicoot and Metroid are great, whereas ice levels in Zelda and Pokemon mostly suck. In the case of Fire Emblem, ice levels are pretty cool, pardon the pun, but rather scarce. Luckily, Conquest had possibly the best ice level in just about any Fire Emblem game, Chapter 8, A Cold Reception. How ironic. Ice levels, especially Fire Emblem ice levels, are usually levels that appear towards the end of the game, whereas in the case of Conquest, A Cold Reception is technically the second level in the game and it's already an ice level. What, did intelligence systems have a deal with Nohr or something? Because I'm getting a serious Crash Bandicoot 2 vibe, and I'm not just talking about the fact that the second level in the game is an ice level, but also that it's one of the best levels in the game. In this chapter, Corrin has been sent off to suppress the rebellion in the Ice Tribes. Man, with all these rebellions against Nohr, you'd think Xander would have come to the conclusion that his father was a bit of a dick much quicker. Anyway, Corrin naturally wants to resolve this peacefully, but sadly the Ice Tribe, after learning who he is, see him as the enemy, and thus hijinks ensues. Now Chapter 8 has many things going for it, but first and foremost is the level itself in terms of atmosphere and visual design. Ah man, this chapter just looks so beautiful with the surrounding ice and atmosphere to create an almost winter wonderland feeling. Much like Chapter 15 of Awakening, the visual aspect alone makes this a strong chapter, but on top of that you get Leo's retainers, Niles and Wayne, I mean Odin, in this chapter. Plus this chapter has some really good level design behind it. Now when I say good level design, I'm referring to the fact that in this chapter, there are 4 houses that you and the enemy can enter, and depending on who gets there first, you can either prevent reinforcements from being summoned or have to face a larger group of enemies. What I like about this is that it allows you the option of playing either offensively or defensively in order to either minimize the fighting or gain more experience points, but also that the game balances its level of difficulty depending on how you play, since if you're good enough you can prevent many reinforcements from being summoned, and if you're not, while you have to deal with more enemies, they are perfectly manageable to deal with provided you aren't reckless. This is level design I'm looking for in a Fire Emblem game, since the game rewards you for top-notch playing skills, while at the same time not punishing you too much for being either new to or bad at the game, as well as catering to many different playstyles and just being such a fun chapter overall. Like I said before, for me, my opinion of ice levels is purely to do with the game in question, and while I certainly love the ice levels in Fire Emblem based Conquest, giving us a beautiful looking level with an interesting premise and a level that caters to players of different skill levels and playstyles. Plus it is in this chapter where people see how Corrin's influence has a positive aspect on Nohr, and it's pretty much the beginning of Corrin's journey to change Nohr from the inside, and all the shit that Corrin goes through to do so.
Embrace the dark, you call home.
Remember when I said Takumi was so butthurt he couldn't wait till the end of the game to fight you? Yeah, well, he wasn't the only one, since Ryoma was also royally pissed that you sided with Nohr, but at the very least he tried to win you back instead of just straight up killing you. And when you meet him once again, he is filled with bitter intrigue. You know something? I've noticed a pattern with some of the best Fire Emblem chapters. Most of them have the main villain or otherwise final boss present within the chapter in order to fill the player with a sense of dread and urgency. Think about it. Chapter 13 of Binding Blade has Seville present throughout most of the chapter, Blood Runs Red from Path of Radiance had the Black Knight show up and scare the shit out of you, and in this case, Chapter 12 of Conquest, since it is in this chapter where Ryoma is the boss and he doesn't look too happy. Even if Ryoma is a little bit of a sourpuss, he can at least be happy that he took part in the second best chapter of Conquest. In Chapter 12, Corrin, after seeing the Rainbow Sage and witnessing him die, in the very same chapter you first see him mind you, that's gotta be a Fire Emblem record at this point, is on his way back to Nohr, but not before Elise catches a nasty disease and needs medicine. As such, the group take her to a nearby palace, but who should be waiting for them but Ryoma? Gee, I wonder how he got there first. Anyway, the point of this chapter is to either escape within 16 turns or defeat the boss. And let's face it, at this point no one stands up to Ryoma, so it looks like there's only one option left. Run like the bitch you are, Corrin. The main gimmick behind this chapter are the various and different medicine pots that are scattered around the map. By breaking these pots, the surrounding units and enemies will either be cured or poisoned, which will either buff or debuff them. This makes Chapter 12 a much more strategic map, since you have to be very careful when breaking these pots, since you don't want the enemy to dogpile you if you break too many, but at the same time you can mend your allies and cripple the enemy depending on the pots you break. Because of this, there are loads of ways in which you can progress with this chapter, either deciding to head straight down the middle or flank the enemy from the sides. And much like Chapter 8, this is another chapter which rewards pro players, since if you can reach the exit within enough turns, you can swipe the treasure from the chest at the end, which while not mandatory, encourages you to try and get to the end as quickly and efficiently as possible. It is also in this chapter where you get access to Xander's retainers Perry and Inigo Laszlo, both of which are solid units, with Perry being one of my favourite Conquest characters. She even made my top 10. Seeing the final boss early on in the game always fills the player with a sense of dread and urgency. Fire Emblem is no stranger to this, and Chapter 12 is another great example of this trope, being a very unique and original chapter with a more strategically focused objective and gimmick in mind, as well as just being so much fun and rewarding top-notch playing skills. And now, all that's left is the number 1 entry.
Embrace the dark, you call home.
Okay, it's finally time to reveal what my favourite chapter in Conquest is, and this chapter, while not the most original and unique chapter, is just so much fun to tackle, and how it impacts on the story really exemplifies the purpose of Conquest's story and the entire theme of Fates in general, because when war comes about, there is always a sense of moral grey. It is never just black and white. Yes! Oh my god, just yes, this chapter is exactly what I wanted from a game like this, and holy shit did it deliver. With a game like Fire Emblem Fates, you want to see how the idea of moral grey is shown through each nation's interactions with one another, and how there is no right and wrong answer at the end of the day. Chapter 18 of Conquest did just that, being one of the best moments in the story, as well as a really fun, if somewhat conventional Fire Emblem chapter. In Chapter 20, Corrin and the rest of Nohr find themselves in the nation of Izumo, a neutral kingdom where no war or fighting can take place. Corrin and the siblings decide to rest up in Izumo after meeting the Archduke Izana, or however you pronounce his name, but suddenly things get very tense when the Hoshido royal family turns up, and within a few seconds each family is at each other's throats, but as the nation is neutral, neither of them can fight here and begrudgingly put away their swords. Later on, Ryoma seeks an audience with Corrin, but Xander isn't too happy about it, and the two bicker as if they were an old married couple, only for Corrin to point out that they are actually rather similar, but apparently according to Ryoma, he's much better looking. However, their conversation is cut short, as Izana turns out to be Zola and he plans to kill the Hoshido royal family. However, Xander finds this to be cowardice and does the unthinkable, as himself, Camilla, Leo and Elise fight against Nohr in order to save Hoshido. The objective of this chapter is to defeat Zola within 20 turns, otherwise Ryoma and everyone else dies, and to do so you have to make your way through the various hordes of enemies and use the right classes at the right time in order to have enough turns left to defeat the boss and open the 2 chests to receive the rewards. Much like both chapter 8 and 12, this is a chapter that is challenging but fair for less experienced players, but offers bonuses for those who are able to progress through the chapter quickly and effectively in order to obtain the rewards. I also like how this chapter really encourages you to use a varied team of units to win and make all of your allies use all of their skills to the best of their abilities. In my case, Charlotte was the star of this map as she was able to one-shot just about every general with a hammer. Now that's what I call hammer time. Once the fun is over and the chapter is complete, Izana and the Hoshido royals are saved and they all have a banquet together. While tensions are still high between the two nations, they at the very least appreciate the help received from Nohr and admit they would have done the same thing had the roles been reversed. And even though most of the conversation is just back and forth with insults, Azura points out that they feel like one big dysfunctional family, but a family nonetheless. This is what Fates is all about, and the idea of moral grey is shown wonderfully in this chapter, since despite their differences, each nation is willing to at the very least aid one another in order to uphold their sense of morals, and there are hints of friendships between the characters, only that it cannot flourish due to the war taking place, and how whether you choose Nohr or Hoshido, neither side is right or wrong, or simply painted in black and white, which is why it takes the number 1 spot of my favourite chapter from Fire Emblem Fates Conquest. This has been CRASHX500. I wish you all a great night, take care, and the chapters in Conquest were some of the most fun I've had in any Fire Emblem game. But sadly not all the chapters were fun. In fact, some of them were either mediocre or downright awful, and the next time we meet, I'll be discussing my top 10 worst chapters in Conquest.
Chapter 10, Chapter 10, Chapter 10.
We get it already!